Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Will there be mass instability or violence like an insurgency or civil war in the US in 2021? What would cause it? I get asked this question a lot. I was asked it last year. Obviously, people were concerned about it. And I want to be clear here. Mass violence is defined as 10,000 deaths or more from a cause like a war or a conflict. So when I say mass instability or violence, I'm not talking, peace attacks here, high murder rates. I'm talking like the things you worry about, you see going on in Afghanistan, you see going on in Syria, you see going on in the US during the 60s, right? During the civil rights movements where there's mass murders, back in the race when the attacks on black communities in the 20s. That's what I mean by mass violence. It's not to say no violence, but specifically mass violence or civil war. I did this, so first of all, there will be clandestine terrorism. One reason I jumped on Nashville, the Christmas morning Nashville, is that was a vehicular-borne improvised explosive device, a VBIED, and it turns out it was a suicide one. That is very concerning because clandestine terrorism is coming to the US, and it's going to probably replace active shooting events as the big thing we all worry about. I don't think it's going to be like, it's not going to be like the Troubles where we have dozens and dozens of bombings on a regular pattern, but it's going to become something that's more prevalent. You may see active shooting events that are ideologically related, more so. Clearly El Paso was ideologically related, but a lot of these ones are other contingencies. But I think you're going to see these clandestine terror events continue and even accelerate in 2021. The conditions are there. But I don't see the conditions being right for civil war and insurgency. Now, last year, I said the window for civil war and insurgency was 2035 to 2045. And really briefly, what that did is that the demographic conditions, which I've gone over before, the physiological barriers, the demographic barrier, the Maslow's hierarchy, those all need to be primed. There needs to be fuel for fire. And those take time to prime. And I said, look, it's going to take time to prime. And then the spark of it, you look at the U.S. Civil War, 41 years it took from the Missouri Compromise to the actual start of the U.S. military war. Now, there was obviously bleeding Kansas and things like that happening before that with mass violence. But what you saw is you begin to see society split. The Baptist and Methodist churches split, the military families split. This leads into civil wars. But why did I think 2035 would be the kickoff? And what's my prediction now? Well, beginning in 2030, you have a structural fiscal collapse in the US. The debt to GDP passes 100% in 2029. Payment on the debts are they begin increasing up a larger and larger share of the government. So the ability to pay for things besides interest reduces. And that becomes a problem because the services, the Social Security, by 2032, we can't pay out full benefits anymore, which means we either need to inflate what we're doing, inflate the currency, or we pay out less. And all of these begin combining that the fulcrum point was in 2035, we begin having the structural fiscal collapse that reduces services, begins doing it. You've had this ideological stuff going on for 15 years, so those are all primed. That's the window for civil war and insurgency. And I don't think we would have gotten to 2049 without some sort of major pressure. But that was all last year, before the pandemic. The major ripple effect of the pandemic, and my concern from civil war insurgencies, has brought that entire timeline to the left, right? We have begun to see the kind of radicalization and ideological fissions that I get worried about being sustained. Those are in place now. That's what you've begun to see in 2020 with the blue and the red going at it. That doesn't mean that it's a civil war next year. It still takes many years, but this level of hatred and division is the priming fuel that gets people ready to take up those arms and engage in mass violence, not just take up an arms and walk around and protest, but engage in mass violence and instability. So that is, that's in place. Now, it may fade, but it's there. Also, the pandemic brought the Social Security shortfall, which was going to be in 2032. It's now somewhere in the 2020s, like 2028, 2029. We don't know. We've spent, first of all, the earning capacity of people has gone down, so the revenues have come down. Plus, we've done these stimulus things, the trillions of dollars of stimulus on top of the tax cuts. Our fiscal situation in the last year went from 2032 being when we couldn't make out full payments to Social Security to now being 2028, 2029, maybe even earlier. So my forecast is no, we're not going to have a civil war, insurgency, or mass violence in 2021. But the time of risk has moved up 5 years. Instead of it being 2035 to 2040, It's now 2030 to 2035, which begins having a countdown that we are near 10 years out from where I see as a high-risk probability of an insurgency or civil war. We need to get our act together. We need to fix these problems and get our fiscal house in order. We need to get the radicalization under control, the ideological, and it takes, you got to do these things or we're going to be in a and it will continue to erode as we move into this. Now, the contingencies that will accelerate make it easier is if both sides cool off, right? If both sides say Trump dies or he goes away and that fades, and then all of a sudden they realize Biden wasn't the socialist that he was promised, you know, because he's not, you know, all of a sudden people go back, COVID's over, we have a good recovery because COVID's over in 2022, and people let the ideological rancor cool. That will be the best thing that can happen, right? Get that partisan rivalry down, where, and especially when it comes to these conspiracy theories. Likelihood of that happening? Not so great. The contingencies that can accelerate it, though, is if either side creates a permanent rigged effect. And we see this now as a game plan. The Republicans are basically saying, well, the state legislature should be able to disregard the popular vote and put in what they think is right because they're alleging fraud they haven't proven. Well, the reason those lawsuits failed is because those laws weren't on the books prior to the election. If the Republicans use, for example, the 2020 census results or the state legislatures they now control to put in place a permanent rig of the result, the blue side is going to look at that as an intolerable excessive step, and that risks violence. On the flip side, if you see massive court packing, and I'm not saying some sort of balancing, but if you see a bunch of Supreme Court justices get jammed through, or they disband the Electoral College and they say, ha ha ha, we're going to do the popular vote, that's also going to be perceived by the red as an intolerable encroachment of the blue. And so there's a lot of these scenarios where if people are like, well, screw you because you know, I don't like you anymore, and there's valid reasons for that, and they proceed on these things that keeps escalating it, that could bring the whole thing forward, because if people begin to think they don't have a legitimate means of impacting the election, elections are always civil wars by other means. They are revolutions by nonviolent means. That's what it doesn't always mean it happens. Participation's big, but the purpose of an election is to avoid the violence. It gives you the ability to express a change without becoming violent. The fallback of an election that you feel is intolerably rigged against you is violence, and that's my concern. The other contingency that could accelerate is if the government itself uses mass violence against the people. That is a pure accelerant. If that happens, all bets are off. Again, it's not very likely. We've had some close calls, especially with the Trump administration. Again, I hope Biden is as boring a president as possible and just calms things down a little bit, gets us back from these conspiracy things of just, you know, imminent destruction and things like that, because we need to cool off. We got about 10 years. It's going to be hard enough as it is with climate change and everything else going on, but hopefully we'll pull out of that. So that's not a great forecast, but that's the forecast. Hey, no civil war next year, just some terrorism. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.